Oh, thank you. I wasn't expecting a response. That was amazing. How are we doing? Nice. Another response. Perfect. We could do this all morning, although I'm out of questions. All right. So today, it's me up here. Jeff already introduced me, so I can ignore the first paragraph of my message because you guys know who I am. Andy, the youth pastor. I've been here for about 8 months now. It's been so fun getting to know everybody, getting to know more about myself as I start up this student ministry, which has also been very fun to be able to do that. Getting to know you guys and doing life and ministry with all of you has been awesome. And yeah, I'm so grateful to be up here. So today, we're in our Romans series. It's week 2, so I'll be talking about Romans 2 with you today. Jeff last week started with Romans 1, of course. That only makes sense. And so today, I'm just going to be sharing some thoughts. I have some takeaways that I gained while studying through this second chapter of Romans. And also, for those of you who don't know, I am actually I think tomorrow's are my last classes, but I'm about 2 weeks away from being done with my master's program, which is very exciting. Oh, thank you. And claps too. Responses and claps is a great crowd this morning. Anyways, so yeah, tomorrow I have my last 3 classes, and then I have a whole bunch of papers due for the next 2 weeks, and then I'm done. But this sermon this morning is actually part of one of my final projects for my New Testament class. So I get to send the recording over to my professor after this. So I'll look in the camera. Dr. Tupamahu, thank you so much for this opportunity for me to be able to come up here and share my takeaways from this passage with all of these lovely people, and I'm able to do it for my project. So let's go ahead and get right into it with that. So the first things first is I'm going to cheat a little bit. I know I said Romans 2, but I'm going to remind us a little bit about Romans 1, the last couple verses more specifically. If you guys weren't here last week or don't remember, the end of chapter 1 ends with Paul, and he has this list of all these sins, all these wicked and evil things that people are doing. And it's very long. It's like a laundry list of a whole bunch of bad things. And then at the end, on top of that, not only are these people doing these sins, they're also encouraging others to do the same. So it's just not, he's painting this bad picture of these people doing these sins and encouraging others to do the same. And then chapter 1 ends, and chapter 2 picks up right from there. And when I was going through the last couple, this list of sins and that Paul's giving, my first kind of takeaway for this morning was something that's just, it's true, that it's just that sin, what sin is, it's something that we do or say or whatever it is that separates us from God. So my first takeaway is that sin separates us from God. And let's go ahead and jump right into chapter 2. We'll read the first couple of verses. Therefore, every one of you who judges is without excuse. For when you judge another, you condemn yourself, since you, the judge, do the same things. We know that God's judgment on those who do such things is based on truth. Do you really think any one of you who judges those who do such things, yet do the same, that you will escape God's judgment? Or do you despise the riches of his kindness, restraint, and patience, not recognizing that God's kindness is intended to lead you to repentance? Because of your hardened and unrepentant heart, you are storing up wrath for yourself in the day of wrath, when God's righteous judgment is revealed. And with that, my next point is that nobody is better than anybody. So these first couple verses here, in this whole chapter really, is very convicting for me. So while I'm up here giving this message, it's just as much for me, and these are things that I'm walking through and struggling with as it is a message for you guys. But just the fact that, it says, those who judge, Paul's pretty much saying, those who judge, you're no better than the people committing the sins. And that's hard for me because, I hate to admit it, but I judge people all of the time. it can be for surface level things, like maybe I think that my shoes are cooler or my outfit's nicer or that my car's nicer, surface level things like that. But a lot of the times it's what the Jewish people were struggling with here that Paul's addressing, is that I'm judging people for how they're living or the sins that they're committing. And Paul kind of punches me in the gut, and he's like, well, you're judging them, and just the fact that you're judging them means that you're no better than them. And that's hard. Paul's saying that we who judge are just as guilty as those that are sinning. We are just as guilty as the people that are committing those sins at the end of chapter 1. And the two big verses for me here are verses 4 and 5. And when I read those, there's two things about God that I gather from those verses. The first one is that God is kind. Perfect. And God is kind in the sense of he's genuinely caring, and he's genuinely understanding, and he's trying to find the best way forward for every single person. That's what God is doing. And I think that's pretty kind. And if that wasn't the case, let's say if God was mean, if it was a mean God, then and God was ready to get on us or like to pounce on us for every wrongdoing that we commit, every sin that we commit, then we wouldn't be here right now. We've been blown off this planet a long time ago, right? But that's not the case. That's not who God is. God is kind. And the other thing that I see that Paul says is that God is patient. And again, even in this chapter, what Paul's talking about, and throughout the whole Bible, God is giving his people the chance to get it together, right? I mean, the whole Bible is just full of stories of us as people failing. God's like, all right, here's another chance, right? And he's giving us this chance to get it together, to turn to him, to ask for forgiveness, and to really trust in him. And what we find is when people actually do that, when they make that turn, that their life kind of starts to piece back together. They kind of get back into shape, right? But what happens, or what if this doesn't work? What if God's kindness and God's patience doesn't have this effect that Paul's talking about? Well, Paul in verses 4 and 5, he kind of declares that if this doesn't work, then simply the people that are doing these things have made themselves more fit for the judgment which will eventually come. And that is also convicting in and of itself as well. Like, so if I don't recognize God's kindness, God's patience, if I despise the riches of those things, if I judge others, even though I sin myself, and I don't turn and I don't ask for forgiveness and I don't trust in God, then I'm kind of getting what I'm asking for in a way, right? And that's what Paul is saying to the Jewish people at the time when he's writing this letter. And I want to skip a little bit ahead in chapter 2. I want to go to verse 11, which is actually my next takeaway, which is God shows no favoritism. And the verse is pretty similar. Verse 11 says, "For there is no favoritism with God." And when I was studying this scripture, when I was going over everything with Jeff asked me a really good question. He's like, well, who do you show favoritism to, right? And I think that's a great question that we can draw from this verse. I mean, God doesn't show favorites, right? And we shouldn't either. But again, like judging others, it can be so easy to do. I mean, I show favorites all of the time, and I don't like to admit that either. And what I've found is that when we're showing favoritism, when we're picking favorites, it's usually the people that are like us, right? It's the people that we get along with easily. But again, that isn't who God is, and that's not who he calls us to be. I mean, we can look at Jesus, the life of Jesus in the gospel, and we can see that he hung out with the outcasts of society, all of the time. That he constantly preached that there is room at the table for everybody, even the people we don't show favoritism for, even the people that aren't like us, even our enemies. There's a seat at the table for them. But That's a whole other sermon. I won't get into that right now. But it's a good one. That's a good though. And the point that Paul is making is that God judges both the Jew and the Gentile equally. And you see, when you kind of look at the history of what's going on here, we can kind of see that the Jewish people were obsessed with the fact that they were God's chosen people and that they had the law. And we'll read a little bit more about it, but when Paul talks about the law here, he means the Jewish law or the Torah or like the first 5 books of the Bible, right? This was the law that was given to Moses on Mount Sinai, and it's the way of life for people that were redeemed at the Exodus. And we can say that it was very specific to the nation of Israel. It was their law that was given to them. And that the Gentiles that Paul's talking about here, or you can also think of the Gentiles as non-Jewish nations, they didn't possess the law. And was like the big deal for the Jewish people back then. It's like, well, we have the law, we're God's chosen people. These dirty Gentiles don't, and look at all these sins that they're committing. Like, you made a whole list of it in chapter 1. Like, we're better than them. And we start to see Paul here turning the tables a little bit. And so, yeah, the Gentiles, they don't possess the law. And as we continue to read, we kind of see that, like, well, that's Paul's whole point with what he's saying. It's like, yeah, they don't possess the law. So, and then here's all this, and we'll continue reading. And this, of course, brings me to my next point, which is it doesn't matter what is on the outside, but what is on the inside. Or the inside is greater than the outside. And I want to look at 2 passages in chapter 2 to kind of drive this point home. The first verses I want to look at are verses 12 through 15. And these are like in the middle of the chapter, and they're also kind of like the heart of what Paul's saying in this chapter. Jeff sermon series title last week was All You Need Is Romans 1:16. If I was following that pattern, my sermon title today would be All You Need Is Romans 2:13. Although that's not my sermon title, although that's a good one. And so let's go ahead and let's read verses 12 through 15 together. All who sin without the law will also perish without the law, and all who sin under the law will be judged by the law. And here's verse 13. For the hearers of the law are not righteous before God, but the doers of the law will be justified. So when Gentiles who do not by nature have the law do what the law demands, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. In verse 15, they show that the work of the law is written on their hearts. Their consciousness confirms this. Their competing thoughts either accuse or even excuse them. And so whenever I'm reading Paul's letters, I always get this question like, okay, Paul, what are you trying to say here? Like, you're saying the word law a whole bunch, right? So what is Paul trying to say here? Well, he's facing, back then when he was writing this letter, he's kind of facing this question where it's like, well, don't the Jewish people, doesn't the Jewish nation, don't they have the advantage? I mean, they have the written law. They literally possess the law, and the Gentiles don't. How can the Gentiles kind of get ahead of this if they don't even have the law to begin with? Like, the Jewish nation definitely has the advantage. Isn't that the truth? And long story short, Paul's saying, no, that's not the case. That doesn't matter. God will judge everyone according to where they are, not according to where they're not. Those outside the law, or the Gentiles, will be judged that way. And those inside the law, the Jewish people, will be judged by the laws that they possess. Because what matters the most is doing the law, not just possessing it. What matters the most is, it's kind of, what Paul's kind of saying here is that, like, actions speak louder than words, right? Like, and to make it applicable for us today, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what we can say we follow Jesus, and we can say we have the love of God, and we can say all these things, but if we don't live it out, then what does that mean, right? It's one thing to tell. I mean, yes, we need to tell people about Jesus, of course, but it's a whole other thing to live out a life that Jesus would, to show people Jesus through our actions. I mean, what I've kind of found is that it's people don't really have a problem with Jesus, right? I mean, if you read the Gospels, you read what Jesus stood for. I mean, I feel like most people can get down with his message, like to take care of the orphans, to love your neighbor, to care for the widows, to help those in need. I mean, that's a good message. And what people have problems with, what I've found, is not Jesus and what Jesus stood for, but it can be me, it can be us, saying that we have God inside of us, that we have the love of God, that God is love, yet we go around judging people for their sins, and we go around and playing favorites all the time. That's what people have problem with. It's not Jesus, it's most of the time it's us. And so I want to go ahead and read the second section for this point. It's verses 25 through 29. And let's go ahead and read that. All right, here we go. Circumcision benefits you if you observe the law. But if you are a lawbreaker, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. So if an uncircumcised man keeps the law's requirements, will not his uncircumcision be counted as circumcision? A man who is physically uncircumcised but who keeps the law will judge you who are a lawbreaker in spite of having the letter of the law and circumcision. For a person is not a Jew who is one outwardly, and true circumcision is not something visible in the flesh. On the contrary, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is of the heart, by the Spirit, not the letter. That person's praise is not from people, but from God. I want to read that again. That person's praise is not from people, but from God. When I was in high school, I went on a mission trip this summer going into my junior year. We went down to Mexico, Tijuana, with Youth with a Mission with YWAM. And towards the end of we were there for a week. Towards the end of the mission trip, we all got to go have a chance to go to the street markets there. And our YWAM leaders, they kind of we were gathered outside, and before we went in, they kind of gave us the rundown. And they're like, yeah, you can go in there and you can kind of negotiate prices, and it's really fun, and there'll be a whole bunch of really cool trinkets and stuff to get, and clothing and whatnot. But they warned us about I remember it was there'll be people there, there'll be tables there selling iPhones for super cheap, and $20 or something, and they're like, don't buy the $20 iPhones. and it's because they don't actually work that well, right? Because they're not the actual iPhone. And so we're like, okay, that makes sense. And so me and my friend Michael, we went in and we were kind of shopping around. We got a couple things. And I saw one of those tables with the iPhones. And the iPhone, I mean, it looked like one. It had the Apple logo on it. It had the button on the screen, the silver back and everything. And it turned on and it had apps and everything. It looked like an iPhone. It was advertised as an iPhone, but it was really just a cheap knockoff, right? It was deceiving. It was very deceiving, and that's kind of Paul's point here in these last couple verses, is that labels, even names, can be deceiving, and he goes deeper. He says sometimes the product itself turns out to not be what it seems, and of course the product in this case, in this chapter, is the chosen people of God, those Jewish people. And the outward label, the badge of Jewish identity for males, was, as Paul is talking here, it was circumcision. And so his point is that the badge of circumcision and even the Jewish name of Israel can be deceiving. Sometimes what's going on inside the package doesn't match the label. And the name on the outside, it doesn't match. And when that happens, the label means the opposite of what it says. So if a Jewish person breaks the law, his circumcision becomes uncircumcision. Not that he ceases to be physically circumcised. Paul isn't talking literally here. But that his real standing before God is the same as that of an uncircumcised Gentile. And this is a big thing to be saying to these people at this time. Because we've been reading so far about how the Jewish people, they kind of view themselves as higher than everybody else, that they're better and they judge the Gentiles for the sins they're committing. And Paul here is tearing all of that down. He's saying, no, you who judge aren't any better than those who are sinning. And God doesn't pick favorites, so neither should you. And this point it's impactful, it's striking enough, and a lot of the Jewish people in the time of Paul were resisting this. But Paul keeps going. This inside-outside reversal works in the other direction as well. So let's say someone who isn't circumcised, or in this case, a Gentile, keeps the law's requirements. What then? What do we do then? How does that make sense? Paul comes to the conclusion here, and boldly comes to this conclusion, may I add. It is as though they are circumcised. So who are these Gentiles who keep the requirement of the law and even fulfill the law despite not having that label? Well, the answer is at the end in verses 28 and 29. You see, Paul isn't referring to like any Gentile who just like happens to be doing like good things, who happens to be putting forth a good effort. He is talking about those who have God's law written on their hearts by the Spirit. Paul declares that the label on the package is irrelevant. It doesn't matter. What is true of the name is true of the label. The circumcision that matters now isn't the physical circumcision, it's that of the heart. And what I find really interesting in this whole chapter is that Paul does not mention Jesus once. But it's clear as you read Romans 2 and really all of Romans that Paul's been dramatically changed. He's seen who Jesus was. He's seen what Jesus went through. And he's like, this doesn't make sense. Like the Jewish people have the law, and now God comes and he dies on the cross, and that's not what the king was supposed to do when he came down. And Paul's radically changed, right? And that's what he's expressing in this letter to the in Romans. And you can see that he understands this new covenant to be a result of what God did through Jesus on the cross. Because we have we have the law that was written that Moses gave the people, that we call it the Mosaic covenant. And when Jesus died on the cross, and really Jesus' whole life, he was bringing in a new covenant. And so it's clear to see that Jesus is all over this chapter. And with that new covenant, I kind of like to think of it as an umbrella. Like, it was the chosen people of God who had the law, and they were marked by circumcision, and that's how you knew that they had the law and they had God. Now it's like this umbrella, and now everybody is welcome into the family of God because of what Jesus did. And that's what Paul is trying to get through to these people, and they're not listening very well. But that's his whole point for what he's saying. It's like, it's not just you guys anymore. Like, the label doesn't matter. It's what's on the inside that's matter. It's the law that's written on the heart that matters. And one interesting thing that I wanted to kind of end with was, in my studies, I was, this is a quote from N.T. Wright. N.T. Wright, if you don't know, he is a biblical scholar, like today, not back in Paul's time. Like, I'm pretty sure he's still alive today. He has a commentary on the whole book of Romans, and at the end of his section of Romans 2, he says this, and I think we have it, right? Oh, perfect. He says, the Hebrew name Judah, from which the word Jew derives, actually means praise. Despite the fact that Paul is writing in Greek, where the point doesn't work, because it's a different language, he is thinking in Hebrew. If it's praise you want, he says, If you want the name that says you can lift up your head and claim your special dignity, then don't look for it in other human beings by boasting of your ethnic status as Jew. Get it from God, when God writes his law on your heart by the Spirit. And today I named my sermon Turning the Tables, because that's what's happening here. And Paul does it a couple times in this chapter. He does it at the beginning when he says those who judge others are just as bad. He's turning the table on the Jewish people. He does it at the end when he says that the packaging and the label doesn't matter. And I think for us today, the tables are turning on us. Like back then in Romans, it was the Jewish people who were judging and showing favoritism and judging people for their sins. And now today, so often it can be me, it can be us that are, as Christians, who are judging others for their sins and not being like us, that we have God and we're forgiven. But it doesn't matter what the label is, right? It doesn't matter what label we have. It doesn't matter if we're in God's family. We need to share that with others. I mean, that's our mission, right? Why would we keep it to ourselves? And so, yeah, that's what I have today.